What kind of a reader are you? That's what I'm going to be asking tonight. Have you ever thought about what kind of a reader you are? It's quite likely that you might never have even pondered the idea. And that's why I'm going to have a chat with you tonight about what kind of a reader you are so that you can think about ways of getting more out of your reading over the next year. So here we are at the beginning of a new year. You've probably all got huge piles of books to be read next to your bedsides, and you might be feeling daunted by that huge pile of books. Don't be daunted, because I'm here to help you to make the most of that pile of books and find new ways of enjoying those books. I'm with you tonight in a rather beautiful new pair of pajamas, because I do personally love to read in my pajamas. I wonder if you have particular outfits that you like to read in, or are you the kind of person that just grabs a book wherever you are? Do you read on the train? Do you read while you're walking? Do you read in other peculiar places? I'd love to talk to you about all of these things. But first, we're actually going to think about the reading brain and what kind of reader you are in terms of the way that your brain experiences reading. So, without delving into it into too much depth immediately, I want you to grab any book that comes to hand. Hopefully, you're at home with some books handy, um, and pick up that book. Ideally, it should be fiction rather than non-fiction. And I'm just looking for my handy book. And I want you to pick up your book, open it at a random page, and then spend 1 minute reading that book. I'm going to time you. Just read from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, or just read for a minute, and then we'll talk about the experience of reading. So it doesn't matter what the book is. I've got this rather exciting book by Elizabeth McNeil that I haven't read yet. So I'm picking it up for the first time. If you've got a book you can just grab from anywhere in your room, pick it up now, and then we're all going to silently read that book together for 1 minute. So I'm starting the 1 minute now, and I hope you're all going to sit and read your books quietly. Okay, we've had a minute. I wonder if, did you actually all sit there and read your books? I hope you did, because I now want you to spend a minute or two thinking about the experience of reading. I know this is a bit of a strange thing to do on an Instagram live. It's something that I do as an exercise with people in the same room quite often, when I hand out a sheet of paper, which is an extract from Alice in Wonderland. And everyone therefore is reading the same thing at the same time, and it's easier to therefore talk about that extract. But I thought it'd be rather fun for you to just grab the nearest book and read that for a minute, and then we can talk about the experience of reading. So I'd also love you to write me comments, because I'd love to know about anyone's experience of reading. So did anyone out there this evening who's watching experience the reading as a very visual experience. Could you see what was happening in the book? Could you see the images? Did the words that you read give little explosions of images in your mind? Because that definitely happened with me. So if I ask you if you are a visual kind of reader, then you'd put up your hand and say, yes, I experience reading in a very visual way. And that's definitely true of me. When I read sentences such as, at the top of the handbill, 3 times the size of any of the other acts, is a man's face. His moustache is curled into 2 sharp brackets, cane held like a thunderbolt. I see that thunderbolt and I see the moustache curled into 2 sharp brackets. It's all incredibly visual. Laughing John, thank you. You are telling me that you're experiencing the writing in a very visual way. Which, Chris, excellent. You're also a visual reader. Good to know. So essentially, there's 2 main types of reader. There's the visual types of reader who experience everything very much as if they're watching a film, really, when they're reading a book. They're not really hearing the words so much as seeing the images, and their imagination is fired up, and they're kind of almost bypassing the language and experiencing the reading as a visual experience. Some people, on the other hand, have a much more auditory experience, and when they're reading any book or novel, they actually hear the words in their head. So they might be looking at the same page as you, and they might hear all the words that are being written. So they're almost reading it aloud in their heads. Now, Boot, hello, lovely to have you here tonight, says usually visual, but what I just read didn't contain images. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what it was that you were reading. So it's interesting when you do start thinking about how you read, and obviously that's why the exercise works better if you're all reading the same thing, because if you're all reading Alice in Wonderland, particularly the extract with the tea party, you would probably all have very similar images in your mind of the Mad Hatter, the teacups, the dormouse, and so on. But there are some people who have a much more auditory experience, and when they read any book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, they actually hear the words written by the author in their head. So it's as if they're reading it aloud in their head. Then there's one other kind of reader, which is the kinesthetic kind of reader. And they are a kind of reader who is so immersed in the book that they feel as if they're actually living the book. So they're completely involved, both visually and physically, in the book. They've become so much part of the story and the page and the fiction that they actually live the book. So effectively, there are 3 kinds of readers. The kinesthetic kind of reader is the most rare, but there are readers like that out there. And I'm now going to talk to you about, once you've established what kind of reader you are through doing an exercise like the one we just did, then you can put various actions into place to become a better reader. So there's a section about this very topic in my very helpful book, The Art of Mindful Reading, and I'm going to read you a little bit from that section, which will explain what I'm talking about. It's actually called, rather helpfully, What Kind of Reader Are You? Do you read aloud in your head? Do you see images in your brain while you read? Are you hearing the words or speaking them silently or even audibly? Might you have an urge to act out in your mind the events in the book? Thanks, Laughing John, for agreeing what a great book this is. I hope that it's very helpful to lots of people. But this is one of the most interesting exercises in it, I have to say. Think about what happens when you read a book. Do you hear each word in your head as you read it? Do you internally use accents for the characters in the novel? Is every word pronounced in your head, or do you flow them together and only hear some of them? Do you move your lips while you read in sync with other words in your brain? Or is your reading more of a visual feast? You vividly picture the scene described, visualizing every leaf, snowflake, or blade of grass. Do you see the scene in colour or in black and white? Some people always see the scenes that they're reading about in black and white, which I find really fascinating, perhaps like dreams. Is your vision based on images you've seen before that are connected with this book, such as from the cover, artwork, or a movie version of the book? Or are they invented for you now? Finally, are you someone who wants to be literally in the scene? When you read about pouring a cup of tea, do you find your hand involuntarily moving? Are your feet kicking if you read about someone running or playing football? Or do you have something to fiddle with while you're reading, like a stress ball? If you're the first kind of reader who internally voices every word, you're more of an audio type of reader. This means that it would suit you very well to listen to audiobooks more and embrace them into your life. So if you establish that you're an auditory kind of reader and that you actually hear every word in your head while you're reading, you should definitely try audiobooks, because you will very likely completely thrive on audiobooks. And someone was commenting earlier on my Facebook post, um, which was about this very idea, saying that they rely on audiobooks and therefore they're a lazy reader. But I would say no, you're not a lazy reader if you're listening to audiobooks. You're actually just freeing up your hands so that you can do other things while you're reading, essentially. Bill is commenting, I'm outside the scene, which is a really interesting thought. Bill, you might have to tell me more about that. Do you mean that you're watching as if from outside the scene, so you're not completely in it? Um, Thank you for loving my top, which is a magnificent pajama top, just to show the full glory of it. I am loving my new pajamas. So, Bill says he's outside the scene. If you can expand on that idea, do. But I'm just going to carry on reading a little bit more from this analysis of what kind of reader you might be. If you do listen to audiobooks, you'll remember the voice of the narrator, and the book will forever be associated with that voice. If you still tend to read rather than listen, your own inner voice will be the one that you remember. If you're the second type of reader, you will think of everything to do with the book in terms of images. So that's the visual type of reader, which frankly is the large majority of readers, generally speaking. The entire book will be shown to you in Technicolor, and you might remember it more like a film. This means you have a strong visual imagination, and you're likely to remember the visual aspects of the book you're reading: landscape, colours, physical descriptions of people, and so on. If you're the third kind of reader, you're kinesthetic. You want to interact physically with what you're reading. You may want to highlight passages in different colours, doodle in the margin, or get up and walk around while reading. If music is playing while you read, this will help you to remember it. And if smells are wafting in your vicinity, these will be integrated into your reading experience. So the kinesthetic kind of reader experiences reading as a whole kind of event, and they actually will benefit very much from going and reading in different places, um, doing things while reading, and playing music or putting on smelly candles, having different aromas, all of which will then be associated with that book forevermore. So I'm just going to make summaries of the helpful suggestions that are in this book, all about if you are one of those different kind of readers. So if you're an auditory kind of reader, you would benefit hugely from spending more time reading aloud or being read to. So there's the good old audiobooks, which many of us know and love, and that's the simplest, quickest way to get your audio hit. But then there's also the idea of being read to, which is a really lovely way of experiencing reading. And actually, being read to used to be, in the good old days, far more of a major life experience. I've got this really fantastic book, um, again, thanks to Bill and Jenny, who are here tonight, The Social Life of Books by Abigail Williams, which is all about how people used to read to each other aloud so much more, in the 18th and 19th centuries and even 17th centuries than they do now. And if we have time, I'm going to read you a little bit about that. But being read to, by other people is a very wonderful and beautiful thing to do, and very much to be encouraged. And there's so many different ways of doing it. You can read to someone while they're doing the dishes. You can read to each other in front of the fire if you're lucky enough to have a log fire. You can read to each other on a beach as you watch the sunset. You can read while sitting around a campfire at night. Or you can even read to each other over Zoom. Why not? In this day of people having to be distanced for many reasons, reading aloud over Zoom can be a really great thing to do. You can have your own candlelit scenarios in the background, and one of you can read to the other person, or you can both have the same book that you can take it in turns to read aloud with. So reading aloud should always be, if possible, a very mutual experience to share with another person or a group of other people, and you should take it in turns to read to each other. But be inventive about different ways of reading aloud. And if you don't have someone that you live with or someone that you can find on Zoom to read aloud with, there are groups of reading aloud opportunities. There's the Reader organisation, who go into communities and read aloud in libraries and other similar places. But there's also places on Facebook where you can find like-minded people who might read aloud with you. So don't be shy. Find somebody to read aloud with you, and embrace that as a new way of sharing reading. And you could also, of course, read aloud simply to yourself. I know that Laughing John has embraced that idea. He's one of our regular joiners of these live sessions, and he told me that he's been reading aloud in his kitchen sometimes, just enjoying the pleasure of reading aloud to himself. And that's also a really great thing to do, because you do experience the book in a different way. So if you're an auditory type of reader, embrace audiobooks and reading aloud. If you're a visual kind of reader, you should choose books with a strong visual theme so as to enter most fully into the fictional world. You might ask yourself, how do I know that the book is going to have a strong visual theme? Well, probably either visit a bibliotherapist like me who'll give you ideas, or actually reading the blurb on the back of the book quite often gives you an idea as to whether it's going to be a visual kind of book, or even just reading a couple of pages of it. So, books like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and indeed all of Hardy's writing, are rich with visual depictions that take you to the places described so vividly that you feel like you live in the cottage with the farm gable or the hut on the edge of a stormy field. When you read your next book, immerse yourself fully into its visual world. Ponder every image for longer than you normally would. If the writer describes the snow that has crept in through a chink in the door, relish that image for a couple of minutes. Picture exactly what it would look like, adding in the missing elements. How big is the cone of powdery snow? What would the footprints look like on the floor? And what exactly would a snow mist look, feel, and taste like? Extend your visual insights into your other senses and allow yourself to enter the scene even more fully. So that's if you're a visual kind of reader. And I've just seen Laughing John's also been mentioning when he reads aloud that he reads aloud in character, which is pretty impressive. So that's taking the audible experience to the next level. If you're going to embrace visual kind of reading and trying to take that into new directions, then, as I was saying in this passage, you can ponder further and mindfully think about the visual ideas within the writing and really linger over those visual images. So, like with the Thomas Hardy concept, he describes very beautifully the cones of snow that are created when the wind blows the cones of snow under the door. And we can almost imagine that right now, even down in the south of England, where it's almost snowing but not quite. And he uses incredibly beautiful visual images, which actually are a joy to really linger and think about for far longer than you might instinctively, because most of us are quite fast and greedy readers wanting to read quickly and get the story. But if you can slow yourself down and read more mindfully, then you can actually deliberately begin to think about every single image that is on the page that you've just read and really allow your mind to meander into new dimensions of what exactly that image might be like, how it works, how it's put together, what directions it might go. And you can really enjoy all those wonderful visual diversions that you can take. And if you are enjoying this kind of concept and you have a bit of a creative bent, then you might also start trying to draw some of those images, maybe even paint them, and not worry about if you think you're hopeless at drawing or painting. Just give it a go and try and express that visual idea to the best that you can on the very book itself or on a separate piece of paper. You might turn your whole book into a visual extravaganza by painting and doodling all over it. So finally, there's the kinesthetic kind of reader, which is the less common kind of reader, but nonetheless, there's quite a few of you out there, you kinesthetes. If you're a kinesthetic kind of reader, there are a few ways that you can enter into your reading more intensely. Walk around while reading the book, for instance. This may seem odd at first, but try it. It is something you can do. How many of you have actually tried walking around while reading? I bet a lot of you have. There's a whole book, Milkman by Anna Burns, in which one of the main characters spends a lot of time walking around the streets of Ireland and reading to herself. And that actually is taken as being a very subversive act. I'm actually very good at walking and reading to myself, as you might expect. And I have many a time been deeply reading on a train and not been able to stop reading and carried on reading walking down the street. And it takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that hard. So walking and reading is a really great way of getting more out of your reading. You can also go and read in an unusual place, in a park, in your garden, on a swing seat where you can rock yourself gently as you read. All of these are slightly more summery activities for those of us who are in a wintry moment. But even in the winter, you might find good places to go and read, which are slightly different to the norm. Because kinesthetic kind of readers do like to be in different places when they're reading, because the reading experience is so much part of their surroundings. You can also play music while you read. Gentle music in the background will help you to remember what you've read and still your mind and body so that you can more easily lose yourself in a book. Some people prefer silence, however. It depends what book works best for you. So obviously, everyone is a different kind of reader, even when you're separated into these categories. So you have to try and see what works best for you. You can also doodle in the pages, highlight phrases, turn down the corners of pages, interact physically with the book. Don't worry about the book being a sacrosanct object. I know some people take issue with this idea and can't bear the idea of writing on books and turning down pages, but I'm a great advocate of interacting with the book, frankly, abusing the book, talking to the book, having a physical relationship with that book, write on it, draw on it, paint on it, turn down the pages, even make little tears in the pages if necessary. Don't worry about it. It's yours. If you got it from the library, then obviously treat it with respect. You could just leave a gentle message in pencil to the next reader. Gone are the days when a book cost you more than a month's wages. In my view, books are improved by the marks we leave on them, especially if it's a mark that's a reaction to something you have read. When you reread the book, that coffee stain, footprint, or splodge of mayonnaise from your sandwich will bring back happy memories of what you were doing when you first read the book. If you're a kinesthetic reader, the body memories left by triggering marks like these will help you to remember the book. If you doodle on the page while reading, and the doodle relates in any way either to the thoughts you're having about the book or the place you are in when you're reading it, this will help you to remember more about the reading experience. And that is definitely true. I love finding books of mine that have stains on them from places that I know I was when I read it. So, for instance, I read Ulysses by James Joyce in on a beach in Trinidad, and it's still got sand from that beach that falls out of some of the pages, and it's just magical to have a bit of a time travel experience when looking at that book again, taking me back 30 years to Trinidad. And any other splodges or coffee stains do always take you straight back to the place you were when you read the book, especially if you might have written a little comment or made a little drawing. It's amazing how those visual aids really help you to remember how you were feeling at the time when you were reading that book. So this will help you remember more about the reading experience, not just what you were reading, but where you were when you read it, what you felt, touched, smelt, and even thought during that particular reading moment. So you can also take your kinesthetic experience of reading to the next level, and you could then act out scenes from the book as well. So if you were reading, for instance, a Thomas Hardy novel, which we know has lots of scenes of agricultural duress, then you might get really into that kind of scene and you might decide to go and walk through an incredibly muddy field, get your hand in the mud, and essentially act out the experience of reading. And this will actually deepen your feelings and experiences of the reading very much. Then, so apart from all of those things, which are great ways of expanding your kinesthetic reading experience, there's also always the option to do something while you read. And this is particularly good for, sorry, I'm just going to have to move a bit of furniture around. The room is not quite big enough for such activities. You can always add extra fun to your reading by hula hooping while you read. Now, am I actually in the frame? Here we go. So this is a great way for kinesthetic readers to get more out of their reading, because some kinesthetic readers can be very restless while reading, and they find it difficult to sit still while reading. And if they're not the type of person who's an auditory reader, they're not necessarily going to enjoy listening to audiobooks and doing other things at the same time. So instead, they can do something with their body while they're reading to themselves. And one of the best things to do, I find, while you're reading, which is actually the least distracting, despite the fact that I keep bashing things because I'm not in the biggest space here, is to hula hoop. It's something that everyone should try, and it could be a great way to get into 2022 and read books while you hula hoop. And you can actually keep going as long as you like. I often spend a good 20 minutes to half an hour of an evening having a bit of a hula hoop and reading while I hula. I can see I'm getting a couple of comments about memories, which is lovely to see. And I don't know if I can get those back. Ooh, Boot Boot. I often use cards as bookmarks, and it's lovely to come back to them again after many years, bringing back memories of the different people who sent the card. Yes, that's a really lovely thing to do. And I would very much say that's a great idea. And I've met people who have similarly put in postcards into their books relating to where they got the book. And they're always really nice to rediscover, which I think is what Boot Boot is saying. So I do think any interactions with books of that nature are a really lovely way to get more out of your reading and add to the reading experience, which is what this evening is all about: how to get more out of your reading in various ways. So I've got a few more thoughts about different types of readers, but before I go on to the kind of character types, different kinds of people who are readers, which is for some reason I'm finding completely impossible to vocalize. I do just want to read you a little bit about the reading brain itself from the amazing Marianne Wolfe, who is an absolutely brilliant writer about the whole process of reading. And if you've never read her before, I thoroughly recommend both this book and her more recent book, which is called Reader Come Home. She's absolutely passionate about reading, and she's also incredibly knowledgeable about the ways that the reading brain works. And she also makes it really interesting. Plus, she's actually really fun to watch on YouTube, etc. Because you might imagine from a book like this that she's a very po-faced kind of academic. But no, she's an amazing, incredibly energetic and animated woman full of fantastic ideas. So I'm going to read you a little bit from Proust and the Squid, which is all about the reading brain. We were never born to read. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the ways we were able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of the species. Reading is one of the single most remarkable inventions in history. The ability to record history is one of its consequences. Our ancestors' invention could come about only because of the human brain's extraordinary ability to make new connections among its existing structures. A process made possible by the brain's ability to be shaped by experience. This plasticity at the heart of the brain's design forms the basis for much of who we are and who we might become. This book tells the story of the reading brain in the context of our unfolding intellectual evolution. The story is changing before our eyes and under the tips of our fingers. The next few decades will witness transformations in our ability to communicate as we recruit new connections in the brain that will propel our intellectual development in new and different ways. Knowing what reading demands of our brain and knowing how it contributes to our capacity to think, to feel, to infer, and to understand other human beings is especially important today as we make the transition from a reading brain to an increasingly digital one. By coming to understand how reading evolved historically, how it is acquired by a child, and how it restructured its biological underpinnings in the brain, we can shed new light on our wondrous complexity as a literate species. So this is a really fascinating book which explores exactly how the reading brain evolved. And I would really urge you to read it if you are interested in how we came to read. But her second book, which is called Reader Come Home, is also all about 20 years later, after she wrote that book, the way that reading is changing now, because so much reading is done on phones, in short bursts, on social media, on Snapchat, and even quite often reading is being replaced by voice messages. People don't necessarily bother to write things anymore. They might just send a vocal message instead. So she does argue very strongly for the importance of still reading in long form as much as possible, and encouraging all kinds of readers to still be able to absorb something in great depth, as well as having the other side of their brain, which is the digital side of the brain, which absorbs things in very short, bite-sized chunks. So she explains it far better than me, but she is a passionate advocate for still reading as much as possible and not devolving into a species that only relies on using grammarless, bite-sized, tiny splices of information, such as we get on Twitter. So that is Marianne Wolf. I'd also just like to mention another really interesting book about the same subject, Reading in the Brain, the New Science of How We Read. And I'll just read you a bit from the back so that you would get a different perspective about the reading brain from the Marianne Wolf one. The act of reading is so easily taken for granted that we forget what an astounding feat it is. How can a few black marks on white paper evoke an entire universe of meanings? It's even more amazing when we consider that we read using a primate brain that evolved to serve an entirely different purpose. In this riveting investigation, Stanislas Dehaney explores every aspect of this human invention, from its origins to its natural underpinnings. A world authority on the subject, Dehaney reveals the hidden logic of spelling, describes pioneering research on how we process languages, and takes us into a new appreciation of the brain and its wondrous capacity to adapt. And it is equally fascinating as the Marianne Wolf. And one of the chapters that I found most interesting was about the very, very beginning of reading, how we learnt to read and write. And I'll just read you a tiny section of it because it's really interesting. In that he's talking about the way that many people believe that reading and writing was a gift from God. At the Egyptian city of Naucratis, there was a famous old god whose name was Thuth. He was the inventor of many arts, such as arithmetic, calculation, geometry, astronomy, drafts, and dice, but his great discovery was the use of letters. That's Plato. The idea that writing is a gift of God recurs in cultures all around the world. The Babylonians thought that all forms of magic, including writing, came from Ea, the god of all wisdom. Assyrians revered Nabu, son of Marduk, who taught mankind arts and crafts, ranging from architecture to writing. In the Hindu religion, Ganesh, the elephant-headed god of wisdom, invented writing. He even broke one of his tusks to use it as a pencil. In the Bible, it was Yahweh himself who handed Moses the Ten Commandments, written in his holy hand. Writing has a very magical quality, not because of anything divine about its origins, but because it greatly increased our brain's capacities. It is close to miraculous that Homo sapiens, a mere primate, was able to dramatically increase its memory by making a few marks on paper. It's pretty insane, isn't it? It is the single most transformative act of evolution, I would contest. So There's so much more to say about reading and different types of readers, and I want to get back on topic about what kind of reader you are. So we have talked about types of readers in terms of your reading brain and the way that you experience reading, but I also just want to talk about the different types of reader in terms of reading personality types, just because it's quite fun. So there's the series junkies who are obsessed with reading a series of books, and the only series of books that I could find as a demonstration to show you doesn't really count. It's the Moomin stories from my childhood, which Chris is watching tonight, seem to have ended up in my home. Sorry about that, because really they belong to all of us. But so this is a series of Moomin books, which I was pretty obsessed with from an early age, and I bet Chris was too, my brother who's out there this evening. Um, but series often might be more like science fiction or detective novels. And I wonder if there's any of you here this evening who are series readers and series watchers in terms of books. Then there's the literary snobs who only want to read the most literary novels, who want to talk about Proust and maybe David Foster Wallace and all the greats who are seen as the most literary writers. And that's obviously quite a large proportion of readers, some would say, are the literary snobs. But then there's also the omnivorous readers, and I would definitely say that I'm one of them, who I can be a literary snob, but I also love to read everything from chick lit to sci-fi to um, detective novels. And I do meet a lot of people who pretty much only read detective novels in my life as a bibliotherapist, and that does seem to be one of the main key characteristics of readers, is people who just love crime fiction. Then there's also the rereaders, the people who love to reread and reread the same book over and over again. There's a whole generation of Harry Potter rereaders who basically only ever read Harry Potter again and again. And not to knock that, because it's great to be reading, but hopefully people will eventually discover other things that they want to read as well. Rereaders are wonderful, and I'm actually a big fan of rereading as well, because I think that when you reread a book, it takes you back in time to the first time that you read that book. So if you read, for instance, 101 Dalmatians when you're 10 years old, and then reread it when you're 18, and reread it again when you're 26 and 36, and read it to your kids. Every time you read it again, it's different, and you are revisiting your old self as a reader. So rereading is a great thing, but there are people who only reread and never read anything new. It seems a bit of a shame. There's also the partial reader, so people that only ever read little bits of books and don't read the whole thing, which I always imagine must be very frustrating. There's the people who always read the end of the book first. And Chris, if you're still there, I think Anna, your partner, is one of those people who loves to read the end of the book at the beginning, which is a pretty mad factor. Is there anyone out there tonight who is the kind of person that reads the end of the book first? There's definitely some of you there. I always find that pretty mad, because I just don't want to have those spoilers. I want to be surprised when I get to the end. And they would also count as a spoiler lover. Then there's also the kind of reader who is a very faddy kind of reader. And I'm just trying to get my props ready so that I can actually give you a little visual for that. So the faddy kind of reader who only ever picks up books from the centre of the bookshop, finding them from the books nearest to the window, who's going for the faddy books which are the ones that are being currently put out there by the bookshop owners, the ones that are being thrust onto us, so the books that are being hyped. So there are those types of readers who are the very faddy types of readers. And then at the other extreme, there's the kinds of readers that hate books that have been hyped and actually avoid them like the plague, refusing to read a book like The Goldfinch, for instance, by Donna Tartt, because everyone else in the world has read that. And they just think, I'm never going to read that because it's had way too much hype. And I do understand that. But often the books that have had the hype might have a reason to have the hype. So one suggestion that Susan and I make in the novel Cure for that situation is to cover the book with either brown paper or silver foil, cover up the cover so that you don't look at it every time and think, it's this book that's been really hyped up and it's going to just annoy me by seeing this book that everyone else in the world has read. So what you do is you cover it up with a bit of silver foil or brown paper or even newspaper, and then you don't get that annoying sense of hype. Some people even go as far as to put the book outside, get a bit of mud on it, stamp on it a little bit, kind of abuse the book so that they can slightly get out their annoyance on the world of hype before reading the book. That works for some people. Sam Hart, lovely to see you here tonight, says that she may be a faddy partial reader, so you don't always finish your books. Intriguingly, I must say it's no bad thing to leave books unfinished. I think it's good to put a book down if you're not really enjoying it. But then maybe if that happens with all the books that you read, then maybe you're just not allowing yourself to get into the book enough. And I would say in that instance, ideally, you need to create yourself a reading nook where you can go in your house, take your book with you, make yourself a really lovely cozy place, maybe a hanging chair, maybe a lovely window seat behind a curtain like good old Jane Eyre used to have, and get yourself cozy in that lovely reading nook, and then sit there for a couple of hours, maybe on a weekend for a few hours, and just read. And that will help you to finish those books. Or make a commitment to read that book with a friend, join a book club, or have a friend that you read the book with in conjunction, so you both promise that you're going to read it within a month and then talk about it later. And yet another option is to decide to read that book aloud with someone that you live with, and that would mean that if you're both enjoying it, then you are going to finish the book. So there's a few suggestions for the faddy partial reader. When I was thinking about tonight, I came across a rather good word, which is procrasti reading, the art of reading instead of doing something else that you should be doing. And in a way, one might describe my whole life as procrasti reading. I'm constantly reading when I ought to be doing probably something more important. But then luckily, I have made a career of that as a bibliotherapist, so I can always justify reading. Hurrah! So procrasti reading is not really procrastinating at all. But I wonder if any of you out there are also procrasti readers. Do you sometimes pick up a book rather guiltily when you know that you actually ought to be working? But I have to say, I'm always keen that reading should not be seen as a guilty habit. It should be something to actually set aside time for and to actively enjoy, and give as many hours as you can to every day, and find different ways of reading if you're not finding that you do have the time to reading. So some of those suggestions for how to read more, hopefully you might be able to bring into your lives. And I will put a few suggestions on my Instagram story for how to get more out of reading, the ways that we were suggesting about after the session. So before coming to an end of this session, I do want to just share a little bit with you from the amazing and wonderful Italo Calvino, one of my favourite writers ever, who, if you haven't read him yet, I would deeply recommend that you do. All of you who are big readers out there, Healthy Living with Connie Newell, great to see you this evening. She says, I do this all the time, meaning the Procrasti Reading, I'm imagining. You would definitely love this book because it's all about reading, the reading experience, and what it is to be a reader. Because this book is written to the reader, which is quite a strange experience in a way, because the writer, Italo Calvino, is actually talking to you as you are reading the book. Calypso, great to see you here joining me this evening. I'm just going to read a little bit from If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, all about reading, and you'll understand what I mean when I've read you a couple of paragraphs. This is the very beginning of the book. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. Relax, concentrate, dispel every other thought. Let the world around you fade. Best to close the door. The TV is always on in the next room. Tell the others right away. No, I don't want to watch TV. Raise your voice. They won't hear you otherwise. I'm reading. I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe they haven't heard you with all that racket. Speak louder. Yell. I'm beginning to read Italo Calvino's new novel. Or if you prefer, don't say anything. Just hope they'll leave you alone. Find the most comfortable position, seated, stretched out, curled up, or lying flat. Flat on your back, on your side, on your stomach, in an easy chair, on the sofa, in the rocker, the deck chair, on the hassock, in the hammock, if you have a hammock. On top of your bed, of course, or in the bed. You can even stand on your hands, head down, in the yoga position, with the book upside down, naturally. Of course, the ideal position for reading is something you can never find. In the old days, they used to read standing up at a lectern. People were accustomed to standing on their feet without moving. They rested like that when they were tired of horseback riding. Nobody ever thought of reading on horseback, and yet now the idea of sitting in the saddle, the book propped against the horse's mane, or maybe tied up to the horse's ear with a special harness, seems attractive to you. With your feet in the stirrups, you should feel quite comfortable for reading. Having your feet up is the first condition for enjoying a read. Well, what are you waiting for? Stretch your legs. Go ahead and put your feet on a cushion or two cushions, the arms of the sofa or the wings of the chair, on the coffee table, on the desk, on the piano, on the globe. Take your shoes off first. If you want, put your feet up. If not, put them back. Now don't stand there with your shoes on one hand and the book in the other. Okay, I won't go on, but you get the general gist. He does go on like that for a while, but then he starts telling a story, and the story does start with If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, and the story carries on through the book, but he also talks to you, the reader, throughout the book, and it's a very seductive read in which it's great fun being that reader who is invented by Italo Calvino for our entertainment, but you feel like you are that reader even while you're reading. I did say I'd read a bit from this, but I fear we don't have time. The Social Life of Books, which is a really interesting discussion about how books were read far more commonly aloud in the 18th and 19th century. Even while people were working, doing manual labour, the humans were the equivalent of audiobooks in those days. People would be persuaded to read aloud while groups of women were sewing or while men were baking and so on. So it was very much a communal experience reading, and I think we should all try and sometimes have reading as communal experiences as well as solitary experiences, because reading as a solitary experience is wonderful, but also reading together is a joyous thing. So what kind of readers are you? Anyone that would like to tell me, please send me a little comment. If you've got any further questions about what we've talked about tonight, do send me an email at ellabear2@gmail.com. And before I go, I just want to show you a couple of lovely books that I've got since last week when I was talking about great female pilots in fiction, because there were a couple of books I was discussing then which I didn't physically have and I now do, and I would love to share those books with you because they are beautiful and I got them for my birthday. Hooray! So this one, Women Aviators, isn't that a gorgeous book, which is a big lovely coffee table book with wonderful photos, and that has all sorts of really fascinating history. It's actually so big that it's quite difficult to show you the pictures, but you get the idea. It's got these wonderful portraits and it goes into the stories of the most famous female aviators over the last 150 years. Also, this one, Magnificent Women and Flying Machines, is a really, Magnificent Women and Flying Machines, that's the title, which is another really fantastic book. The first 200 years of British women in the sky. And that is another gorgeous book with some photos, but this is much more of a excellent collection of stories all about the first female British aviators, and it's actually written in a really great tone. It's very funny, it's quite irreverent. All kudos to our foremothers who said knickers to peril and prejudice and went ahead with their ambitions regardless. Knickers to peril and prejudice is what we should all be saying. So thanks so much for coming for a lovely evening of bibliotherapy. Next week, I do believe I'm going to be on the Damien Barr Literary Salon Facebook and Instagram page, but I'll confirm that because I have slightly lost track of dates and it might be the week after that I'm doing that. Whatever happens, I will be here with you doing bibliotherapy live one way or another, whether it's on my page or on his page. So thanks so much for joining me tonight and lovely to see you. Great to see you, Cyber Flaneurs, Salomon Peretz, and everyone else that came this evening, who I haven't been able to see your names because they don't always show up. But lovely to see you. Thanks for coming. And I'll see you next week. Good night and Happy New Year.